Hello, me dears. I've seen a lot of conversations lately, and by lately I am referring to like a month or two ago because I film things in advance and also I'm always late to the party to begin with, about media literacy. And that was not a topic I was going to initially talk about, but I've had a few things come up in my reviews lately that I think bring up interesting discussions around media literacy, particularly around minority representation. I want to talk about them. So here we are. Also, for instance, you did. I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a, well, it's a rainbow dress. You can't see that. All you can see is the purple straps. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Now, step one is, what is media literacy? Because it's become a bit of a buzzword lately. That and also critical thinking. Now, critical thinking is the skill set of looking at things, analyzing them, interpreting them, and coming up with judgments and conclusions based on that. Like, if somebody was trying to say, convince you to go check out their van full of puppies and saying, don't worry, it's super safe. Just come look at my puppies in this white van over here. You might use your critical thinking skills to think, now, why would they want me to go see their van of puppies? Are those puppies real? Does this situation feel similar to a situation I saw in the news recently? Is this a safe choice? And then you would not get murdered. Media literacy is using critical thinking skills to look at media, much of which involves figuring out the messaging of that media. And media encompasses everything from books to TV to art to what you see on the news to the poster down the street to TikTok to YouTube comments and everything in between. And the biggest and most important part of media literacy is acknowledging that all media holds meaning and purpose. And that purpose may just be, I want to describe this thing because it's pretty, or hey, look how silly and random this thing is, but those things are still purposes. And also things that are silly and random or beautiful often are that way because they're related to something going on socially at the time. What I mean by this more generally is that a media literate person should be able to look at media and figure out generally who the target audience is, what the context the thing was created in, what story it's trying to tell, who's benefiting from that story, and what potentially harmful or biased messaging may be involved. And also like, what the point of the story was and if they were successful in telling that story. I think that's a big thing that we see on Broadway specifically with theater, where we're like, okay, this is the story they were trying to tell, this is how they told it, was that a successful adaptation or was that a successful way of telling that story? The tricky thing about media is that we consume so much of it all the time, and increasingly more with the 24-hour news cycle and social media, all that good stuff, and our brain filters it in and then filters it out and doesn't always pay attention to where that information is coming from. We talk about this a lot with news programs where we're like, people who watch Fox get completely different news from people who watch MSNBC, even though it's the same story to begin with. But there's also phenomena in media where you see super stereotypical media representation on, say, your comfort TV show that you just watch without thinking about it because it's your comfort show, and then you end up feeling prejudiced toward those people when you meet them in real life and don't realize that it's not reality, that's not actually your gut telling you the right thing, it's just how you've been conditioned to see people like that. And it can also work in reverse, where somebody who has never met somebody of a certain minority but have seen them portrayed really well in a TV show, and then they meet somebody like that in person and they're therefore more comfortable around them, which is why passively and uncritically consuming media can be very, very dangerous. But a common thing that comes up a lot around media literacy is the whole like, it's not that deep, you're overanalyzing it, can we just have fun criticism things, which in my case, I get those comments the most on popular fandoms that I talk about, but they're also always phrased in the most misogynistic way possible. And because I'm media literate, I can look at that, know it came from a place of complete bias, and therefore it doesn't really bother me. But still, this idea that it is pretentious and obtuse to look past the surface level understanding of a piece in media is a very serious issue because media very much impacts how we see the world. Way more than we like to think it does. And that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy problematic things. I'm a disability scholar who regularly rewatches The Greatest Showman because it's a really fun time. It's a wrong time. It's a concerning time, but Pasek and Paul are very good at what they do, and I will always love their music no matter what the context of it is, and as far as I'm concerned, that movie is just songs and dancing. There's no dialogue or plot. I don't watch that bit. I also made a 90-minute breakdown video of how I'm concerned about how The Who's Tommy handles disability, and then immediately bought another ticket to go see the show on Broadway again with all my friends because I wanted to see it without having to take notes the whole time, because it has a lot of problems, but that doesn't mean it is not also, again, a super fun time. I, as a media historian, am firmly of the opinion that we need to keep harmful works around with disclaimers and academic conversations around them so that we can learn from them. Seeing something super racist from 30 years ago means that when you see something more more subliminally racist from today, you'll understand why it's racist and also where that trope came from. Everything was inspired by something and then inspired something else, and erasing history never does anybody any good. But again, with the caveat that the history is being consumed with the context that it has issues. Like, I feel like we're kind of at a point where Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, when it's being staged, there's a talkback or a note in the program that talks about its issues with anti-Semitism, or like really obvious and deliberate casting choices and publicity to indicate that that has been acknowledged and discussed. We're also seeing that play be staged less but discussed in academics more, which I think is an important shift. Another example of something like this would be how Disney was putting like disclaimers on Disney Plus in front of films with some racist themes and caricatures and whatnot, and acknowledging that, hey, maybe that one song in Peter Pan, you know the one, is an issue. And they're acknowledging that, and they're putting a disclaimer on it. And speaking of academics, the education system seems to be the root cause of why people hate media literacy so much. And it's because our system teaches to the test, not to the creation of an actual skill set for everything. That's just how we teach, specifically in the US. I'm familiar with how the education system works in Italy, but not really anywhere else. But this means that when we teach literature, the only correct interpretation is the one the teacher has, or the AP test has. And that makes literature analysis feel less like having fun engaging in the text and coming up with cool ideas, and more like a really bad game of mind reading that you are destined to fail. And it means that when we think about literary analysis down the line, all we can think about is having to write that essay about why the author chose a very specific style of couch for a specific room, when for you think they just wanted to describe what the room looked like, but the teacher's convinced that it symbolizes something specific that you don't see, when both answers are correct, because the sheer amount of possibilities is the whole point of analyzing media. When I was putting together my Hunchback research, I read countless articles by disability scholars that use the exact same handful of lines and character traits, but then each scholar used that same evidence to make a completely different point from the other, and it was fantastic because that's how actual academic media analysis works. But in high school English class, where you're trying to find the right interpretation to get a good grade on your AP Lit exam, or whether you're trying to spend an entire class period parsing out every single piece of a single sentence rather than looking at overall themes and allusions, it feels tedious and pretentious and pointless when what they're actually doing is teaching you the skill set to recognize propaganda. It's just being taught in the most unhelpful, unmotivating way possible. A really great example of this is the yellow wallpaper, which I did a disability analysis of a few months ago. I'll link it up here for you. I hated that story in high school. I hated it. We had to make a list of all the characters and the conflict of the story and the objects and the symbols and the themes. I still have the document in my Google Drive, and I, as my autistic, consistently metaphor missing self, didn't get a lot of the things for my list, and I felt like therefore I wasn't capable of understanding literature even though I'd read Little Women cover to cover in the 4th grade. I got something out of reading the yellow wallpaper. I initially thought it was really interesting and I wanted to dive into it, but because of how much we discussed it and how much I felt like I'd read a completely different story from everybody else in that room, I stopped caring about the analysis beyond what would get me a good grade and didn't really think to look back at it at any point. But when I revisited it a few months ago because I was curious, I decided to look at the wider context in which that story sits, and I discovered that the author was racist and ableist despite being disabled herself, and that not only had she created the story for a very hyper-specific purpose, she published that purpose as well. She was like, this is the point of writing this thing. And learning about her life and the historical context in which the story was written, not only did I easily see all the metaphors and symbols that I missed in that stupid chart, but I realized that certain things were meant to mean completely different things than what I was told they were supposed to mean objectively. And then suddenly I was interested in this story again because there were so many more ideas, there was so much more like depth and things to dive into, because the context is way more captivating than the story itself, particularly how it was deliberately republished in a way that sort of divorced it from the initial context, and that's why we see it in the light today that we see it. Which goes to show that all art is political and nothing is created in a vacuum, despite us often teaching it separate from both of those things. We also often teach plays like they're sit down or read it literature books, which is a disservice to the medium in my opinion, especially when it comes to teaching Shakespeare, but that's a conversation for another day. Analyzing art means figuring out who made it, if they've stated why they've made it, because a lot of them have, what was going on around that person, or more generally in that time to motivate the creation of that thing. We see trends of specific things in literature over time because of a certain event going on in that time period. Also, we can bring capitalism into this. Why is this or is this not profitable? What motivated this art to be made? Why was the audience responding to it this way or that way? Has the audience response to it changed over time? Why is that the case? Also, when we bring in target audience, different things hold different meanings for who they're meant for. And when it comes to minority representation, we want to be saying different things to different target audiences, and we have to plan for that. There are media representations of disability that I have no problem watching, but I would never recommend to anybody outside of the community. There are things that adults are going to understand are an issue and kids are going to take take at face value, there are things that young people will understand are an issue but period accurate, and adults will look at it and go, ah yes, the good old days. There's also the question of separating the art from the artist, because I think that you could love something and not like who created it. Like, I know Harry Potter is still a huge and important part of many people's lives, but they also refuse to do anything that might put more money into the pocket of J.K. Rowling for obvious reasons. And you can like the art without liking the artist, but you also can't pretend the artist of a work didn't exist, because the way that they see the world, their biases, their opinions, their politics, all ended up in the art that they made and are therefore being passed along to you. And by ignoring the artist, you are consuming that message uncritically, which is an issue. Like, using Harry Potter again, I read it when I was pretty little, and I didn't even think about how racist the names Cho Chang and Kingsley Shacklebolt were until many years later when I saw others bring it up, and I was like, oh my gosh, what did I absorb and not realize, and has changed the way that I look at the world in a very harmful way from those texts. The other thing about context is the more media you consume, the more you realize how everything is inspired by something else, particularly when it comes to reading older literature. Like, what have I read for this channel? Gatsby, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice specifically, and so many of the films that I watched review, I always find things and I'm like, it's from that! That's from, oh, this makes sense. And I'm like connecting all these dots. It's kind of like when you start watching old episodes of SNL and then like Monty Python and you're like, that's where all of my dad's vocabulary comes from. It's that situation, but for media analysis. It's great. Seeing how much all art is intertwined with the legacy of other art is just, it's so beautiful to me. I love it so much. Another thing that I find really interesting, particularly when it comes to minority media representation, is when something accidentally implies something it did not mean to apply because maybe it didn't understand the history behind the handful of pieces it was inspired by. A great example of this being Poor Things, where it clearly meant to be a Frankenstein-esque narrative, but Frankenstein-esque narratives were created in an era that was deliberately paying attention to and acknowledging differences of bodies to make a point in reference to disability. And so the way that this ended up coming across was as a caricature of autistic people, which then ended up sort of undercutting its own purpose as a work because the director saw it as one story when a large portion of the audience ended up seeing it as something else. And this is a situation where the gut reaction is to be like, well, the creator of the art isn't responsible for how it's perceived once they make it, it's just out of their hands. But particularly when minority issues come into play, there is some semblance of responsibility of those creating media to acknowledge that what they create has impact on the population that consumes that media. And particularly when minority issues come into play, there's an even greater responsibility to handle them ethically, because at this point, most people assume, or at least hope, that studios and creatives are doing their due diligence when they create that minority representation, when the majority of them are not. But then it's also interesting, particularly with Poor Things, but also this happens on Broadway a lot, where they use disability aesthetics and almost certainly don't realize their disability aesthetics because they borrow those aesthetics from a different situation that they didn't realize was based on disability, and so they don't think about needing to hire a scholar to consult with in regards to disability to make sure they don't accidentally, with the narrative that is meant to say one thing, accidentally send out a completely different message in regards to something else they did not intend. I once worked on a project where some people had a really great idea in regards to demonstrating something to do with race, and I was like, just a heads up, this is an image that you're creating that kind of mimics this thing from disability history, and everybody was like, oh, we didn't mean to do that, and then we came up with something new because we didn't want to accidentally create that double meaning. A thing that comes up in visual art every couple years is there's a situation where somebody will like make a cool geometric design and then try to sell it, and then somebody else points out that they totally just made a swastika by accident. And we all bring what we know of the world to the table when it comes to art. And even if the intentions were good, obviously we have a right to be frustrated about something if it comes across in a harmful way. And it's one thing if it's like a single person or a handful of people working on a small project and whoops, we made a hate symbol, versus if it's like a big budget movie with a massive staff that really should have talked to a DEI person. But I do think that that is an interesting discussion about the responsibility of storytelling and who that responsibility is on. Some other things that have come up in reviews for me are situations where I have lots of people suggest certain characters from certain shows as autistic because they view them that way, but then when I look at them, I see what is clearly a completely different narrative being played out that looks like autistic coding. So like, for one example, when I reviewed Ted Lasso, which is a show that talks about fragile masculinity in the sports world, I was given a lot of the characters as autistic coded because they were unable to feel or explain their emotions, when to me, since the overall narrative is focused around toxic masculinity forcing men to not be able to be in touch with their emotions, and them learning how to do that from each other and unpacking that over the course of 3 seasons, that's what I saw them as, dudes who are not great with their emotions. And in many situations, that looks like autistic coding, but I couldn't see past that because I knew what the narrative goal of the character was, even though my entire job is to spot hidden disability, I still couldn't see it. Another example is whenever I review sitcoms, which are my most requested reviews, and this is a medium where everybody's autistic coded or otherwise neurodivergent coded because every character is an archetype, a caricature of a person with a handful of traits blown up to 1,000%, and the way that we diagnose neurodivergence is by saying somebody has too much or too little of a certain trait, and so they map across as looking fairly similar. This is why this also works for Winnie the Pooh, or Piglet is super worried all the time, and Eeyore is super sad all the time, and Tigger's very energetic, etc., etc. And these characters are archetypes of specific things, but they come across as neurodivergent coded because they are singular to one specific trait. But this is also super interesting because a lot of comedic archetypes find their roots in clown, and clown likely isn't entirely based in developmentally and intellectually disabled people, but when court jesters were becoming quite popular and the concept of clown was kind of crafting into what we know it as today, this is the same era that disabled people were being kept as pets in courts and used for entertainment, and many not-disabled clowns would mimic the disabled people in order to get laughs, which then evolved into the kinds of clown that we see today. So if you go all the way back around, you do end up with them actually being based on real neurodivergent people, more or less, just historically, because we found our way into being archetyped. The third category of thing that I end up reviewing a lot, or being asked to review a lot, is non-humans who end up being autistic coded, like the main two guys from Good Omens. I know that show very well. And Baymax from Big Hero 6. And in this case, aspects of autism like atypical speech patterns, inability to explain or describe emotions, and serious struggles in social interactions, or more generally like subtlety and blending in, these are used to mark this character as clearly non-human. They're quirky, they're weird, they don't fit in with everyone else, but they need to be human-ish enough that the audience finds them compelling or interesting or heartbreaking, whatever, and can follow what they're doing, and so thus we end up with most of our non-human characters as deeply autistic, which is an issue because the more we equate autistic traits with non-humans, the more people in real life see us as non-human. And then it gets even worse when, if they're a character that doesn't speak much, they usually just take autistic coding and then take the traits of a puppy and then they put them together and they're like, here, have a new character instead. And the legacy of this one is also interesting because Spock from Star Trek, also a non-human character, is sort of seen by the autistic community as the original autistic coded character. I don't know if he specifically started the trend of autistic coding non-human characters or if that was a thing before then, because the Hays Code era of films is not one I'm I'm familiar with it, but I'm not incredibly familiar with it. I'm working on that. But I do think at least some of this legacy today specifically definitely comes from him, as does the use of Spock as an insult for autistic people. And I'm always torn on what to do with these characters that fit into these autistic coded but not categories, because to me, they don't feel autistic because I'm looking at it beyond that, at the narrative reason for their autistic coding, but then I also completely understand why they'd be perceived as autistic by audiences, and frankly, earlier in my career, I would have agreed they're autistic coded as well because I saw them that way too, and so I reviewed them as such. But at the end of the day, that is the case. They are autistic coded, but it's also other things at the same time that create that autistic coding because different tropes all intertwine to create new things. And in that case, disability is being used as a narrative tool the same way we use physical disability as a narrative tool, which is easier for me to point out. But then also, if I'm arguing that this is not actually autistic coding and it's something else, at what point would I also have to then categorize disability coding in general, for a specific narrative purpose, as also not actually disability coding because it's for that narrative purpose, when it's clearly perceived by the audience as disability and doing active harm to the disabled community? So it's all very confusing and complicated and messy. And I'm not quite sure where I land on all of that. I'm still kind of pondering it. But that's why this is fun and interesting, and this conversation is fun, and why media literacy is not pretentious. It's just an interesting thing to talk about. And also why we need to be teaching high school literature this way, with tons of conflicting ideas rather than a small handful of supposed correct answers. So I do think that we're moving more into a, if you can argue it, I'll give you a good grade, even if it's not my interpretation situation than we used to be, which is good. But in the realm of how does one get better at media literacy, the basic answer is to keep consuming media and keep asking questions about it. Specifically, look for what information is being shared, what feeling is being expressed, the aesthetic of the message, the values being shared through that message. What does it remind you of? Is it similar to something else? Do you think it's inspired by something else? Who's the story meant for? Who does the story serve? One thing that's really helped me to learn how to synthesize information in this way is when I go see shows on Broadway, I pay attention to the different design pieces and the different performances, and then I will guess what other projects they've worked on because all art is intertwined. And then when I get home, I'll look at the playbill, and then I will 9 times out of 10 have guessed the lighting designer correctly. But the main skill set of media literacy is just critical thinking, towards media. So that is taking in information, breaking it down and synthesizing it, comparing it to other things, and then coming to your own conclusions about it with all of the information rather than just the information that they're trying to directly present to you. And a superpower of that skill set is you can acknowledge when propaganda is happening and not fall for it. You also begin to understand how stories work and how stories are used, and then you can start telling stories and creating narratives in a much more deliberate way, which is helpful in pretty much every career that you could possibly ever do. It also helps to differentiate between bad art and bad narrative, if that makes sense. Like, I think we have a huge issue right now where people are critiquing art and then other people are like, you're critiquing it because you're a hater and you don't like it, when half the time people are critiquing it and they're doing that because they like some aspects of it and they want other aspects to be better. And also, critiques of art are like half the point of art. And some artistic critiques can be pretentious, right? But most of it isn't, and I'm very tired of people pretending like it is because it's really annoying. But anyway, that's all I have for today. This was a short, more conversational video. I've just been very interested of late by how different people perceive different media and how we often treat art as if it's created in a vacuum when that's not how art works. Art is an inherently political and collaborative medium. So yeah, I would say, like, hopefully this can be helpful to help you learn to look at things more critically, but I think that does sum up my entire channel. So I will list some of my favorite books specific to disability media tropes and analysis below if you want to learn more about this stuff, because it's a really fun time and you should learn about it. And as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.